I think we are all interested in self-help programs, ways in which we can improve our own understanding of ourselves and other people. These programs have led to a wide variety of systems and a considerable literature available to persons who wish to study the complex natures of their own minds and emotions. One of the difficulties which has presented itself is the comparative inability of the individual to get a sufficiently separate look at himself or herself to make this type of information, this procedure, essentially useful. After all, we seek the remedy with the same faculties that caused the trouble. Our own attitudes, our basic concepts upon life and living problems have in some way failed, or we are not in need of psychological assistance. With this failure, we must analyze the cause of failure in our own natures. And because of certain prejudices or certain limitations, we got into trouble. And how to merely think our way through these is not always clear. Too often, we use the same faculties in an effort to rationalize the difficulty or the complicated situation. Actually, these faculties are not sufficient, because with these same faculties we did rationalize ourselves into the situation. Somewhere, some way, we must attain a level by means of which we can examine ourselves in a new way. But unless self-examination is better than the previous level of conduct, we are not going to arrive at satisfactory solution. We can affirm for almost everyone that we live in the midst of a degree of confusion. We sense constantly that we lack something that is necessary to self-guidance. We realize that we lack self-control, that we lack discrimination, perhaps patience, and very often a certain quality of detachment by means of which we can estimate values correctly. Nearly everyone is in trouble because of too much attachment. And this attachment problem extends over nearly every field of human endeavor. Some individuals are too much attached to the world in which they live. Others are too much attached to their own internal psychic lives. A great many are attached to their opinions, others to their convictions, which are opinions greatly intensified by some overvalue. Some are attached to their hopes, others to their fears. A great many are attached to previous misfortunes, and a few, perhaps, are the victims of attachment to previous fortunes. Nearly always, the individual is overshadowed by intangibles at the very time when he should most come to a tangible conclusion. To escape from this overshadowing, to escape from these overtones that confuse, these undertones which depress, the person must seek some broader and deeper integration. No one in this world ever suffers from a problem they've solved. Out of solution comes release, and there is no release apart from solution. And by solution, we must ultimately recognize the correct answer, that answer which comes the nearest and most completely in harmony with natural law and universal procedure. In search for solution, therefore, we turn in various directions. We turn to the opinions of others. Yet if we included in our consideration of other people's opinions a bit of biographical research, we might discover that they have not solved their problems any better than we have. Thus, we observe the great interval between good advice and poor practice. We know that many persons of distinction have suffered mostly from the very opinions which they have passed on to others. Thus, we cannot depend completely upon authority for solution. It is always helpful and always useful to seek out the traditional, acceptable answers to things. But these must also be subjected to a certain degree of further investigation. Acceptance of any idea without thoughtfulness cannot be said to contribute with surety toward a solution of a difficulty. Why do we have some of these complicated problems? One of the reasons probably is that we are not able to be contemporary in consciousness. By this I do not mean that we should accept everything that is happening around us, but rather that we should rescue our centers of consciousness from addiction to the past and hope for the future. Now, some folks will say, well, that hope for the future is the only thing they live for, because our great desire, our great expectation, our almost inevitable need is the will-o'-the-wisp of future security. Without the hope that the future would be better, very few persons would have the courage to continue a life pattern. Yet actually, it is not hope that the future will be better that is solutional. And a vast amount of energy is exhausted in hoping that should be dedicated to actually making certain that the future is better. This concept that we have, that by the same drifting process that has brought insecurity for half a lifetime, we will ultimately drift into security. This is more or less of an illusion. It seldom, if ever, fulfills itself. The individual who drifts can only drift from one insecurity to another. The probability of accidentally arriving at a good port out of the storm of life is very small. And where we think we have found persons who have done so, analysis will indicate usually that they were working from a plan or a pattern and were not depending upon this process of drift. The only thing we will usually do is drift onto rocks and have further shipwreck. If then we look at the cause of some of these problems, we observe a peculiar circumstance that exists always in nature, a circumstance that we must study. I do not know how many of us have thought this through, but to me it is very important. Namely, that nearly all decision has to be made under circumstances in which decision is most likely to be unsound. The child, for example, growing up in life, is usually required to select a career at a period in life when he has no way of knowing what he should select. He must decide at 20 the kind of life he wants at 40. Yet at 20 he is utterly unqualified to do so. We must decide now, in many instances, the kind of future that we will live in when we know more than we do now. We must attempt to create patterns of experience when we are without adequate experience. And we must strive for a better way of life from a level in which we have not attained that better way of life. Consequently, in most cases, important decisions are not made from the best levels of knowledge or information. This is why we have a tendency to turn to our elders for guidance or help, seeking to gain from the experience of those more mature than ourselves some insight into the probable decisions that would be best for us. Unfortunately, the elder is also in confusion. His own future is uncertain, and he is out of touch with the experience through which we are passing. Having gone beyond it, it has faded from his actual awareness. And in these days particularly, when things move very rapidly, the decisions of a person of 50 may well belong to 20 or 30 years ago and be comparatively useless to the young person of today. All of these elements, pressures, have to be in some way analyzed. Is it possible for a person who has not experienced to come to a reasonable and rational solution to his own need? Is it possible for youth to plan its own maturity and do so in a way that will not ultimately result in disaster? The only answer to this lies in the fact that man has a compound nature. One part of this nature is concerned principally with immediate matters and is developed from immediate association and experience. Each individual, however, also has within himself a dimension of timelessness. Therefore, we have to regard decision as occurring on two levels. One is a level based upon emergency and immediacy, as it is now. The other type of decision must be based upon timeless value. And great systems of thinking have emphasized that there are principles that are timeless, and that these principles can be captured at various periods in a person's career, and the understanding of them produces value, strength, or character, which can by application be adjusted to the time changes on the lower level of action. This is why it is so important for young people to have good indoctrination in basic principles, in value. And this is where, up to the present time, education has been most negligent. It has completely omitted or ignored the problem of value. It has not equipped the individual to use first those faculties which are nearest to life itself. Actually, for example, there is no moment in which we are nearer to reality than the moment that we are born. Our very early infancy is more factual than any other part of our living. But hardly do we escape from infancy then we begin to fall into associational mechanisms and processes. By degrees, the natural integrity of infancy is destroyed by the accumulated pressure of environment. Thus, the straightforwardness, the strange inevitability of natural insight is frustrated, and we lose the use of it as a determining and conditioning factor. Once we have lost this, we are already heavily burdened with those negative pressures which are going to ultimately get us into trouble. We then attempt to solve the trouble by leaning more upon accumulated tradition than our weight will support or sustain. We cannot achieve security merely by obedience to tradition. Psychology, working with the individual, finds what they term an unadjusted person. This is a person who does not fit into the pattern of things. Therefore, the immediate effort to overcome this unadjusted state, to strengthen adjustment, to bring the person into conformity with the world in which he lives. To do this, he must be brought into conformity with a world of suffering. And in order to be in conformity with a world of suffering, he also must suffer. And by attaining a sufficient and significant degree of personal misfortune, he becomes like everyone else. Out of this, of course, come then the dilemmas of his own existence. And he discovers that he is tied to society by common dilemma, rather than by any positive understanding of value. Trying to find a solution to this causes the person to turn into himself. Why is he in this condition? How is he going to escape from the misfortunes of life and at the same time preserve any happiness which he may have accomplished? The average person's life is not one long interlude of misery. It has some delightful spots in it. If he is an optimist, he will forget the misery. If he is a pessimist, he will forget the bright places. But life is actually a series of experiences, some of which we wish to remember, and others which we hope to forget. Out of this mixed situation, other values begin also to become apparent. One is that because we do enjoy certain happiness and have certain fulfillment which is satisfactory, there must be some things that we are doing reasonably well. Then there are other things which, no matter how difficult they appear, still seemingly we can face with a good hope. But most of all, there is a core of unsolved problem which hangs over our heads like the sword of Damocles, or in international affairs hangs over the peace of the world as an eternal threat of war. Thus, even while we have a certain security, insecurity is always threatening us, impinging upon us, forcing us to keep up this strange struggle with which we are engaged. Modern Western psychology makes a great deal of the importance of this struggle. This struggle is really living, according to a great many authorities on the subject. The individual who is up to his neck in trouble and is floundering around is a man of action. The fact that his action is merely a desperate effort not to drown is overlooked. We are assured that if we did not have this tremendous pressure behind us, if we were not living perpetually on the surface of a volcano, if we were not constantly and continuously struggling simply to survive, We are warned that if these pressures did not exist, we would soon slip into a state of negative security. There would be no more progress. There would no more be advancement. And we would become a strange, pathetic, negative group of people following some strange fantasy such as Oriental yoga or something of that nature. So, as the Southern preacher observed on one Sunday morning in church, when he chose as his theme, when the Lord sends tribulation, he expects us to tribulate. And this, to a degree, is our attitude on this. Theology has assured us that we are here to tribulate, that we are here to suffer, and from suffering to gradually gain a kind of spiritual strength, the strength of the individual who can suffer with dignity to the end of his life. This particular perspective is not too intriguing these days either, and those who wish to attain reputation for dignified suffering are few in number. If, however, we assume that action, regardless of quality, is the desired thing, that we must be busy whether we are doing anything or not, then obviously our civilization is an outstanding success. If, however, action should have meaning, action should be purposed, and action should be under the dominion of principle and character, then we are not quite so successful. In this, then, we turn into ourselves and we use some approved text to try to find out what is wrong. This in itself is quite a dangerous and exciting adventure. In the years immediately following the Civil War, this country was deluged with patent medicines of all kinds. That was long before these same patent medicines became sanctified by the great pharmaceutical associations. We're still having them, but we can no longer pronounce the names. They are no longer swamp root and sarsaparilla, but we still have them. But in those glorious days of patent medicines, sale depended very largely upon the description on the back of the bottle of the symptoms of the various ailments for which the remedy was a cure. It explained the mysterious aches and pains that you should be suffering from if you took the remedy, that you should have certain symptoms, and as you studied through these symptoms, you realized by degrees that you had them all. This was the subtle salesmanship of the procedure. And therefore you bought the remedy in tremendous quantities. I know one old farmer that always bought his favorite remedy in case lots. He was taking no chance of ever having future need without the remedy being available. In the small print, it was often either noted or left unnoted, because there were no laws governing those problems at that time, that this particular remedy was 92 5/10% alcohol. And it was therefore rather evident that large and continual dosage might produce a rather bland attitude toward life. In the same way, on a different level, we are not reading the symptoms on the bottle, we are reading the symptoms on the printed page. It is no longer connected with patent medicines, but it is definitely connected with a formula of self-analysis. And as the individual reads down the list of possible complexes, neurotic tensions, psychoses, phobias, neuroses, fixations, to say nothing of some of the more elegant ailments, such as paranoia, dementia, and the problem of the manic depressive, by the time he gets through, the individual is overwhelmed with the realization of the number of things that could be wrong with him. And being a little probably neurotic, or otherwise he wouldn't have been looking in the book at all, he is all ready for trouble. One by one, he identifies himself with these symbols. One by one, he reads the case histories of the forlorn persons who have had experiences like his own. And finally, he comes to the first basic conclusion that whatever is wrong with him, it is not trivial. Also, he gradually, through further experiment, discovers that whatever is wrong with him, the remedy is not cheap. He finds himself confronted with the urgency for a general psychological house cleaning. In order to attain this house cleaning, he must shop around and find specialists in the field, associate himself with them, and hope for the best. That he probably does have some of the problems that he finds in the book cannot be denied. And certainly there are values in many of the suggestions that are given to him. But to weigh his own case, select from theoretical or case histories those fragments of therapy suitable to his need, such procedures require a great deal of discrimination. And if he had had that much discrimination, he probably would not need the remedy. He is seeking to develop discrimination in the presence of ailments due to the lack thereof. This can be a basis of great stress and strain, not only to the person, but to his friends, relatives, and associates. He has a tendency to become more and more fixed upon his own ailments. And the remedy in this case is so much more complicated than the old swamp root that served so many uses for his ancestors, that it is difficult for him to arrive at proper conclusions. I remember one interesting example of the old farmer who had a good supply of certain suggested remedies when the family horse began to develop the symptoms. The instinct was that if it was good for man, it was good for beast, to give it to the horse. The remedy, however, didn't work quite that way. The farmer continued to improve under the remedy, but the horse did not get well. The reason being that the horse could not read the label on the bottle and was not given the psychological assurance of the effectiveness of the remedy. In the same general problem of how far can we go in the basic study of psychology, apply it to ourselves, and get some basic good out of it. One thing I think we can agree that psychology has done for us that has been helpful, and that is, it has slowly but certainly pointed out to the individual that the cause and solution of most of his problems lie within himself. This is a basic, factual thing. We're all right up to this point, But when we begin to analyze the application of remedies, we begin to lose certain enthusiasm. That the individual is moving falsely from pressures rather than from values may also be broadly accepted. In other words, when a person says, "I want," we now know that he may be, in this very statement, a very brief one, stating a basic untruth. He may not want. This individual is not usually speaking from the I level at all. He is speaking merely from the level of pressure. We are constantly struggling for things that we believe that we want, and we do not really desire them. A large part of our struggle in life is merely struggle of defense and escape. And the problem of defense and escape means that we are defending error and attempting to escape consequences. And this is a long, hard job. And millions of persons waste their lives on these projects. And no matter how much we defend what is not so, or how desperately we attempt to escape from the consequences of our own mistakes, we can never achieve either. We must continue to be the inevitable consequences of our own attitudes and convictions. This brings us to another, almost irrefutable fact. Namely, if we are not happy, there is something wrong with us. Now, this is quite an escape from the 15th, 16th, and 17th century attitudes. Renaissance man was never able to associate himself with the responsibility for his own conduct. 19th century man, for the most part, blamed his environment for his own troubles. 20th century man is beginning to recognize that trouble begins inside. And what we call environmental trouble is simply everyone sharing his internal troubles with other people. If then psychology can bring home to us certain basic principles, including self-responsibility for security and insecurity, if psychology can further reveal to us that the individual who is miserable cannot be right, and that the individual who is sick is in some way living contrary to fact. If he can come to these basic realizations, we have accomplished almost more than can be hoped for in a single generation. If we can cause the person to gradually get over the foolish belief that his happiness and unhappiness are due to other people, if we can get him past that, we can open to him a great universe of hope. Now, we will say that the very statement that we are responsible for our own troubles is the most discouraging of all. Faced with this, our entire philosophy of life may crumble, because we have built our way of life upon an aggressive conviction that we could do as we please and that other people would have to get along with us as best they could. Of course, we did not want other people to do as they pleased. And when they did, and they did things we did not like, then they became the direct causes of our misery. But our causations, good or bad, should not be regarded as the cause of anyone else's misery. The ridiculousness of the situation is apparent if we give it any thought. But once we have settled our minds upon a course of action, we do not think. And to that degree, we are in trouble. If, therefore, we also wish to take the attitude that to blame ourselves is morbid and likely to prove most discouraging, let us see the happy side of that conviction. No individual can ever hope for happiness or hope for security if he must depend upon the environment around him for these values. In other words, suppose as a person we stood in the midst of a world and our happiness depended completely upon the mass motion of that world. We could say to ourselves, I can never be happy while the Russians and the Chinese and others of that caliber are breathing down the neck of the democratic way of life. Never can be happy. I can never be happy because the house in which I live does not dominate the neighborhood. I can never be happy because other people do not understand me. I can never be happy as long as the world is in a state of inflation, and I will be more unhappy if it falls into a depression. I can never be happy because taxes are taking the larger part of my income. I can never be happy because my children are costing more than I can afford. I can never be happy because my car will not be paid for until it is worn out, and then I will have to buy a new one. My happiness being bound entirely to the opinions of my friends, the advice of my mother-in-law, and other related matters, how do we ever expect to be happy under those conditions? Do we really believe that all the people in the world who disagree with us are either going to reform or fall dead? Do we honestly think that the business in which we work and against which we complain at all times except while we are collecting the paycheck, that this business is suddenly going to change and become the beautiful idealistic structure we have dreamed of? Do we actually believe that we can move out of it and move into another business and be much better off? Perhaps occasionally, but not with certainty. Therefore, if the way other people treat us is the basis of happiness and security, we are sunk. There is no hope. The whole world is not going to change to please us, because it is composed of 2.5 billion human beings waiting constantly for everyone else to change. To say the least, it is going to be most confusing. Now we have also a type of mind in this emergency which sort of cuts the Gordian knot. We have the materialist or the disillusioned realist who says, well, it isn't going to change, nothing is going to happen about it, this is the way it is, so what? There is a certain futility in this attitude also. It is so dynamically futile that even those who are teaching it and preaching it cannot live with it. It is very difficult for a person to accept defeatism totally and say, this is the way it is, this is the way it is going to be. No one can ever do anything about it, except to hope that perhaps 10,000 years from now, technology will solve it. Such is not a good answer. The individual who follows it is not usually any happier because of his disillusionment. He is likely to fall only into cynicism, extreme skepticism, and a generally unpleasant relationship with life. As a result of this attitude, most of your so-called realists in science and even in industry divide their lives sharply into two segments. One in which they are addicted to their beliefs, and in the other they are allowing themselves to relax into their hopes. But they never bring these two things together because they are utterly contradictory. If there is an answer anywhere for these problems, and the problems themselves are infinitely diversified, in spite of the fact that we can divide human problems into approximately 40 situations, we can combine these 40 situations into a group that is legion. No two persons are the same, nor do they bring identically the same resources to any problem, nor is the sequence of problem unfoldment in their lives identical with the same sequence unfoldment in other lives. Consequently, actually, there must be, finally, as many remedies as there are persons. And while we can achieve certain broad patterns, there is only one person in the world capable of understanding us, and that's ourselves. Others may do a pretty good job of it, but they can never have the certainty that we have. So gradually we are forced to the creative, idealistic, and progressive realization that the remedy, like the ailment, must originate in man, must come out of the individual, and that therefore it is possible for the individual to solve his problem without waiting for the whole world to enter some paradisical state that has been long in appearing. Therefore, we are not actually in a terrible discouragement when we take the attitude of self-responsibility. We are beginning to face the only answer that can possibly work. On all this point of view, psychology is laying more and more stress. But the psychologist, while he is not always an ideal character by any means, also has a side to his problem. He is working with a group of persons called patients or consultants or whatever they may be. And this group of persons is not essentially a group dedicated to self-recovery. The individual does not want to place his life on a solid foundation. What he really wants is to have unpleasant symptoms removed and to continue to do the things he has always done, whether they be right or wrong. The idea of imposing a kind of discipline upon ourselves leaves us cold. We have had the feeling that while we were in school and while we were children and while we were forced to accept discipline, we had all we wanted. And that one of the symptoms of maturity is that no one else can tell us anything. That we wish to be free agents, that we wish to do as we please. With this to work with, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, the doctor is against a very desperate situation. One rather prominent practitioner told me not long ago, he said, we are a most frustrated group ourselves. And one of our grand frustrations is that no matter what we know or what we believe we can accomplish, we are seldom, if ever, given the opportunity. We get an individual who is badly involved in a problem. He talks about it. He gets it out of his system. We've just about begin to see something we might be able to do for him. But because he's talked it out of his system, and because he believes we are magicians and not physicians, he begins to feel a little better. So we never see him again. And this is not only the person whose means perhaps force him to stop treatment. Among those who we never see again are those to whom the cost of psychological work means nothing. They are simply not interested in any more than the alleviation of a dominant symptom. If you can block that symptom, if you can give them a psychological equivalent to an aspirin tablet, they are completely satisfied. They are almost afraid that they might be educated into a better way of life. And that might cause them to be forced to give up certain practices, policies, or attitudes which they wish to continue to have. And the most common attitude that people want to protect is the attitude that others are responsible for their trouble. They never want to be educated out of that. They never want to take the final step toward emancipation by assuming full responsibility for conduct. This is too large a challenge. And one of the reasons why it is too large a challenge is because the average person, throughout his educational and early professional or business experience, has never been instructed in how to handle himself as a being, how to integrate his own resources. So the subject comes to him as more difficult than calculus would be to a kindergarten student. He is simply not equipped for the problem. Now, recognizing this phase of it, which is positive and is factual, we then turn to the negative phase. Most persons are in trouble essentially because of fear. Fear is the foundation impulse behind both defense and escape. The individual who is not in a reasonably normal pattern is afraid of something. He may be afraid of himself, afraid of other people, afraid of circumstances. He may be afraid of society. He may also simply be afraid to be a person, because if he becomes an individual, he may lose adjustment with the collective. He is afraid to be better than other people, because it will open him perhaps even to ridicule. He is afraid to be worse than other people, simply because it is likely to land him in jail. He is afraid. And out of this fear, he develops a chain of weakness reactions. Reactions which are constantly tearing down whatever courage he may have, and forcing him to seek some kind of solace of an imaginary or escape nature or kind. If this person, with forebodings and misgivings, becomes too involved in psychological thought without leadership or direction or control, he is apt merely to become more and more aware of what could be wrong with him, more and more concerned over the probable development of his own symptoms. The most difficult person in the world to treat when he is sick is a doctor, because he knows too much about his own symptoms. And as one said to me, he hasn't quite as much faith in the medical profession as an outsider might have. These problems affect also in the psychological field. Many psychologists who are sincere people are completely nonplussed when the would-be patient proceeds to analyze himself out of some popular publication. He begins to tell the psychologist what is wrong with him, which is embarrassing, because it probably is not right. But if the psychologist does not agree, in all probabilities, the patient will search for advice elsewhere. He is going to regard himself as more correct than the professional who may know what he is doing. As a result of this kind of situation, we have on all fields of therapy today the patient who comes to the doctor and demands certain medication, whether he needs it or not, because he's read about it, because he's heard about it, and because his neighbors recommend it strongly. Out of this has come a great deal of tragedy. On the psychological level, a little knowledge can truly be a dangerous thing, because it does not give us an adequate perspective on things. One simple example is the materialistic textbook, which tries to explain the origin of our troubles. It proceeds to go back into heredity. It analyzes all of the traditional reports that could influence a person's life. It then goes into childhood environment, searching out all kinds of difficult situations which might have contributed to the difficulty. It takes generally the attitude that the faculties of man must be conditioned by some force outside of man in order to take on the peculiarly tragic situations which develop. Out of all of this, therefore, the patient comes up with a tremendous sense of injustice. He is a victim. Nothing that he could do about it could prevent the fact that the situations in his early life and his hereditary endowments have doomed him to be a hopeless neurotic. This is not cheerful to begin with. Nor is it cheerful if he learns that even by analysis, this neurosis can be cleared up. Supposing he is assured, and it is demonstrable to him, that in a year of treatment he can get over 75% of these neurotic pressures. Is he happy? No. Why? Because he was 54 years old when he went to the psychologist. And he has already been miserable for 54 years because of things that he was not responsible for. And the discovery that he is not responsible and that something else or something can be done for him leaves him rather cold. He looks back upon a ruined life which he is now able to ascribe to other people. Supposing at 55 or 56 he is a nice, well-balanced person, having come out better than the average from psychological counseling. He is now going to start at 55 to try and live as though he had been imprisoned falsely for 55 years. Is he therefore going to suddenly become an optimistic member of society? Unlikely in the extreme. He is far more likely to say, well, if I've been wrong all this time, whatever little comfort I think I have found from being wrong, I might as well stay with it, because I'm not going to live long enough to in any way compensate for the time that has been lost. So the very situation that other people have placed him in this predicament will probably cause a great deal of basic acidity in his own temperament and nature. Well, you can also say that if he wakes up at 54 to the discovery that it is his own fault, he is not in a much happier situation. He is, however, 1 degree ahead. At 55, he has discovered honesty. Now, this is a discovery, at least. Otherwise, by the other method, at 55, he has discovered dishonesty. He is able to convict the universe of a heartless fraud against himself. He is able to believe that there is so little fairness in this world that he could be a sufferer for the best part of his life simply because of what other people did to him. Out of this comes nothing that can be of any value to him whatsoever. Out, however, of the conviction that there was self-responsibility involved, there can be a tremendous personal, internal growth. The individual may never be able to completely escape from regret, but he at least is not going to escape from the implication of character. And if at 55 an individual wakes up to the realization that he is the maker and breaker of his own destiny, then he has awakened. Whereas if he continues to blame it on someone else, he is only sleeping deeper than he was before. And at 55, an individual awaking to a fact can begin to enrich his internal life, even if he cannot perhaps restore a career that has already been damaged by previous conduct. Actually, if we must face something, if we must ultimately do something about our problem, it is much better that we come finally to a discovery of honesty than that we come to a discovery which only perpetuates the same illusions from which we have previously been afflicted. Thus, it is not, in my thinking, too wise for the individual to try to use psychological technique as a means of continuing to prove that he is the victim of circumstances. The psychologist himself must ultimately correct this situation, or he is going to end with an amoral and unethical code. A code which will not contribute to the essential growth of man. It may help over an emergency, as a dangerous drug may save a life. But a dangerous drug cannot actually assure the individual of future health. And if continued beyond a certain degree, the drug itself may prove fatal. We cannot, therefore, depend upon this type of therapy, nor should we allow it to come in upon our own lives, causing us to come to an invalid conclusion, the conclusion that we have functioned from and been miserable with for years, namely that other people are to blame. How then can we perhaps work into a more constructive relationship? What can we do in the form of psychoanalysis in order to find some available means of correcting a problem? Naturally, we don't read these books and we do not study these systems just for fun. We are looking for something. And to look means we recognize a need. If we recognize a need, we must also have enough courage or enough conviction to act according to our own discovery. Why it is that we can learn so much and do so little has been one of the riddles of the ages. It is simply that we have never put our hearts really into self-improvement. We have always been much more interested in the improvement of others. And in this case, it is not as unselfish as it sounds. because this improvement of others becomes a substitution for our failure to improve ourselves. And in order that life may not appear to be totally fruitless, we wish to appear to have helped somebody else. But we have never solved the great center which needed help most, our own natures. If you have noticed, and you probably have, that most persons under psychic pressure or under psychic stress exhibit a wide variety of tension symptoms. They are mostly nervous wrecks. There are other varieties, but these certainly are the more common. They are persons tired out, worn out. They are persons inclined to constantly discuss themselves as far as their miseries, misfortunes, and reverses are concerned. They are loaded with self-pity. And no matter what happens, it is not important unless it can be applied to themselves in a negative way. Every common disaster reminds them of their own private disaster. And every bit of good news coming to someone else is a further tragedy. These people resent the happiness of others because they do not have it themselves. If they actually changed place with the person of whom they are resenting, they would immediately be just as miserable as they are now. Experience with these people, and of course they, like all other kinds, come in families, and therefore are a problem for their relatives. The problem of catering to these people, trying to make life easier for them, acknowledging that they are hypersensitive, that they are almost too sensitive to live in this world, that they are going to be blighted by every early frost that comes, causes us to put them in various kinds of mental and emotional hothouses. We try to keep every chill away from them. But in some mysterious way, they still get the chill because it's coming from inside. So we do everything possible. We sacrifice our own lives for them. We humor them to the end. And they die just as miserable as they might have had we totally ignored them. So nurturing these cases, working with them, struggling to bring that little look of happiness to that sad and washed out face does not accomplish anything. Even if they finally smile, it is only through the smile that they tell us that all this reminds them of how much they have previously suffered. Consequently, you cannot solve it by such procedure, and no one has ever been able to. That these problems must be faced by the individual with a certain directness, we know, and being martyred to these neurotic tensions of others hasn't helped them and has probably helped to build similar tensions in ourselves. So the world consists of the martyred and those who must nurse them, and who thereby become martyrs also, giving up their own lives sometimes simply to protect some unreasonable and outrageous individual. Such catering, having no effective result that means anything, forces us back to the original assumption, namely that pressure and tension, constantly moving the individual, results in the situation described by Schopenhauer, in which he says that pain is the result of obstructed will. The will of the individual meeting any obstacle, the result is hurt. And man's great idea of nirvana is actually the infinite expression of his own will without obstacle. But as he lives with 2.5 billion obstacles, he is not so likely to succeed. And even assuming that all these obstacles were cooperating, which they're not, he still has another obstacle, The fact that his own abilities will not permit him to fulfill his own will. He may have an inevitable will to play the piano, but without the disciplining of his hands, this will also will come to frustration, because his very body will not sustain it. So the first and primary frustration against the will energy of each person is his own ineptitude. And he cannot escape from this, except by doing something about it. Which brings us back to the basic principle of therapy, namely that we must do something about these things. But assuming that nearly all of our troubles are due to pressures actually coming from within, pressures of unsatisfied ambitions, pressures which create further pressure, we then come to another important situation, namely that our pressure moving out from ourselves can in turn practically wreck our environment. And as a result of wrecking our environment, force us to live in things around us that seem bad, but the cause is actually in our own relationship to them. By the time we get through annoying, disillusioning, and fussing with our friends and associates, they get a little tired. Therefore, they promptly depart to other locations, and we are alone. Then aloneness becomes one of our big problems, and we blame environment for that, realizing that we have been working all our lives to make sure that we were isolated. We wanted to make perfectly certain that we didn't have a friend left. And when we succeed, then we are more miserable. Thus, our environment is not merely the pressure of other things, it is a reactive pressure of ourselves. And as a proof of that, we can observe that another person in the same environment is not under the same pressures that we are. Therefore, the environment is not the empiric cause. It is merely a secondary or reflecting cause of the problem which particularly worries or causes anxiety in ourselves at any given moment. The answer has always been one thing, but it is something we have trouble with, namely the reduction of pressure. Behind nearly every problem that we have is too much misdirected pressure, force, the uncontrolled exercise of will. The individual moving from the foundation that he has a right to do anything that he has a will to do. And this will, without the censorship of reason, without the moral guidance of affection and friendship, this will, continuing to force its way, forces us all into early graves. The will, in order to serve us, must be an agent of achievement and not an eternal and continuing nagging, a tremendous, dynamic, uncontrolled, and undirected. To remove this pressure of will, therefore, there has to be a new type of outlet for the individual. This outlet has as its final purpose the breaking up of the ultimate and utter self-involvement of the person. The individual is in trouble because his mind is so continuously on himself and on his purposes, his objectives, and the contemplation of the resistance which these purposes and objectives meet, that he is continually under stress. This stress cannot be removed merely by removing the symptom. we can get out of a phobia or a complex. We can rationalize our way through it. And after a certain amount of treatment, if we suffer from claustrophobia, the chances are we will be sufficiently recovered so that we can ride in an elevator or that we can go into a closet and close the door. These things can be accomplished. But hardly do we get this remedy and begin to feel a little rejoicing over it. Then we discover that the uncorrected pressure is beginning to break out somewhere else. We recover from the claustrophobia only to discover that we are developing alcoholism, or that instead of being afraid of the closed room, we are suddenly afraid of our neighbors or afraid of other situations around us in daily life. Thus, the pressure, not having been cured at its root, merely takes on new symptoms and adapts itself to some other stress point in our personality. The pressure has not subsided. We have merely corrected one symbolic testimony to that pressure. The reduction of pressure itself has an interesting history. Actually, the purpose of civilization is to reduce pressure. That is the essential purpose of it. First of all, as Cicero tells us, civilization is a condition in which human beings live together for mutual cooperation and mutual helpfulness, and, to a measure, mutual protection. On this foundation, it is the purpose of civilization to make a new arrangement between individuals in which human beings are no longer either enemies nor strangers, but fellow members of a commonwealth of purposes. Thus, the end of civilization is that we may gain a sense of strength from collectivity and no longer be alone in a world of frightening magnitudes. Civilization creates this kind of community coziness. It closes off a certain part of the world and makes it necessary for us to adjust only with an area of values which we gradually come to know and understand. We can't say that this is the ultimate, but it certainly is an immediate factor in connection with the concept of civilization. Now, civilization involves something else. Civilization cannot survive without culture. A civilization is not merely persons running machines side by side. And civilization which is only mechanistic or is highly competitive causes the individual to merely come into a new kind of isolation. Instead of fear of the collective unknown and of nature and the universe, man gradually comes to fear man. And any civilization in which there is no culture ends in mutual fear. Culture, therefore, has to supply the connective values by which a civilization becomes, in a sense, a great family involving positive emotional values, aesthetic values, and intellectual companionship. The great advantage of culture is that it is nature's way of helping man to lower tension. The truly civilized human being is no longer living as a center of will surrounded only by obstacle. He has found channels of expression, and these channels of expression are bridges with other human beings. He is finding comradeship on a level above mere economic or political structure. Culture, therefore, implies a variety of accomplishments and a degree of insight. The cultured person has learned to moderate certain excesses by giving new and valid channels to his resources. He is no longer utterly one-pointed. To the cultured individual, the achievement of one's particular goal is not the ultimate desire or determination. Culture has a tendency to diffuse man's interest. It has a tendency to cause him to become aware of different levels of values and to attain an insight into these different important possibilities in connection with conduct. Culture promotes leisure, and without leisure there is no culture. Without culture there is no such a thing as leisure. Because without culture, time that is not used is simply wasted, and that is not leisure. Leisure is the opportunity of the individual to act without desperation. It is the power to proceed, to express self without force. Leisure, therefore, is not a driving thing. It is a persuasive thing. It invites the person to let down pressures and be himself. And between man and normalcy, in most cases, there is simply this formula. We must let down pressure and be self. This is a little confusing, however, because most persons consider pressure to be self. I'm alive, therefore I am ambitious. But in the end, I am ambitious, therefore ultimately I will not be alive. It doesn't work as well as we might think. But assuming ourselves to be merely centers of pressure, we live only in intensity and fear relaxation more than we fear death. The reason why we fear relaxation is simply because we are not able to relax into a cultural state. We relax into a barbarism. We relax into a primitive savagery because with all of our attention we have never had an opportunity or an inclination to build personal character. Without character we cannot use leisure. Our answer then is a long-range program. Not one in which we merely try to adjust our tensions to the tensions of others, but one in which we discover that by the basic lowering of tension, we increase efficiency and decrease many of the ailments from which we are now suffering. And the decrease of tension is a process of self-education. What we need is educational therapy. Or perhaps equally we could say that we need an educated therapy and a therapy of education. Now, education is a nasty word for most people. Once they've graduated from school, they never want to hear of it again. But education has, unfortunately, so little comparison with schooling that we do not need to be so afraid of the word. When we think of education, the 6th grade should never come to our minds, nor the campus curriculum for that matter. Education means the gradual maturing of insight. Education means the development of a civilized attitude within the consciousness of the person. It means that he gradually develops values which are in themselves therapeutic to him and which give him proper and natural release for the energies which are now causing tension, stress, frustration, and neurosis. this therapy is possible to the person himself. It is quite possible for him to begin simple lessons in therapy. And I think one of the simplest of all lessons that you can work with is to remember one thing. We use a phrase constantly. An individual will say, "I am lost in reverie." Another person will say, "Jones is simply buried in his work." Another one will say that Smith has lost selfness in the thing he is doing. He is absorbed, which means that he is diffused through it, or has gone and become identified and identical with it. The great value of absorption lies in one thing. You cannot be absorbed in anything and have your mind on yourself. That is the very point of absorption. It is loss of self-interest. And this loss of self-interest always accompanies the discovery of a purpose or an interest or a need greater than self. We can never be absorbed in something smaller than we are, any more than we could be drowned in a bucket we could not get into, unless, of course, we wish to fall on our face and dip our head in the bucket. That is conceivable, but usually at the last moment there is relentance and the head comes out. Actually, therefore, to be truly deep in something means that this something is large, larger than ourselves, more ingratiating, more intriguing, more stimulating, more involving than ourselves. Or it is something with which, through our affections or our emotions, we have created an allegiance, which therefore demands a dedication large enough for us to sacrifice self, more or less willingly, to this thing which is bigger. But the most important of all points is this absorption in something bigger. Let's take a very simple example of this. Suppose that you are a great music lover, that the thing you love more than anything in the world is a great symphony. You really are, in heart and soul, a person fond of music. It may be perfectly possible that you are a garage mechanic, or that you are a lawyer, or that you are a businessman, but in your heart and soul you love music. So the symphony time comes, and you buy the season ticket. And you go, and you are particularly pleased with the conductor. You consider the performance to be outstanding, and they are playing a piece for which you have extraordinary fondness. In a very few moments, an experience happens which, because of the very nature of it, you never analyze. And that is that suddenly, in your rapt attention, you are no longer aware of yourself. You are no longer aware that you are listening to the music. Perhaps symbolically, to try to make this more complete, you will automatically or instinctively close your eyes. You want to shut out these things. But suddenly there is only music. There is the individual moving by every mood of the music. You cannot imagine the person completely enraptured with Beethoven being aware at that instant that he is driving an unpaid-for automobile. When he goes out and gets it at the parking lot, he may remember that. But while he is listening to that music, he does not remember. While he is listening to that music, he does not remember the bad day at the office. He does not remember the family quarrel. These personal things have ceased because a peculiar rapport has been established and the faculties are totally absorbed in the contemplation of music. Furthermore, this individual is no longer aware that he is trying to listen. The volitional factor of keeping his mind on the music is no longer valid. The only person who has to keep his mind on it is the person who does not understand it. But if there is real sympathy, real understanding, or real acceptance of beauty, the person is not trying to listen. And while this music is being played, the music by Beethoven exists, but the listener does not. He is no longer aware of his own existence. And in this total unawareness of his own existence, he has discovered another thing, that this very state makes his faculties more awake, more responsive, and more inclusive in their cognition than his previous state was. While he was worrying about this, fearing that, wondering about something else, he could not listen. When he truly listens, therefore, he discovers that he achieves a total cognition because he is no longer in his own way. In psychological problem, this total cognition results from absorption in interest outside of and apart from self. It is an available acceptance. And instead of making life smaller, it makes it larger. And it is the basis of true perceiving, of true knowing on every level of cognition. And true knowing is the great therapy against the wrong knowing which makes neurosis possible. Thus, the individual seeking psychotherapy is better to have his mind off of himself than on it. But there is no use in transferring the mind from self to problem. The purpose in every case is that the transference must be upward to something larger, something more valuable, something more essentially real than the level of the problem. The person, therefore, who finds the greatest security in living is the one whose living is meaningful. And to be meaningful, meaning must come above self. When this particular phase of the problem is more emphasized, we will have a preventive psychology that can be important. The preventive psychology which implies that the only solution to a level of thinking is to break through that level, to raise the consciousness and the mental faculties to security by giving them power and authority over the situation that previously enslaved them. We can always outgrow by enriching the internal value, but we can never outgrow by simply cutting the heads off the dragon. For as in the case of the Greek legend, for every head that we cut off, 5 more grow. The only way to destroy this dragon of neurosis is to lower the estimation of self-circumstance in the consciousness and character of the person. He must get over being a totally locked, isolated self. And to do this, he must break through into those things in which the tensions are not present. And through leisure and through culture and through society, through thoughtfulness, the person broadens his world, in this way broadening his sphere of interests. And as these interests draw his attention away from himself, he discovers that he functions better. And that if he can achieve a marked degree of this detachment, his health will improve, his job will be better done, he will have more energy, because his energy will not be diluted by the pressures by which he exhausts it. Thus, in psychology, this problem of self-analysis must also include the dimension of release from self-hypnosis. The person must be in a condition to relax away from the domination and tyranny of self-purpose and recognize a universal purpose, which is therapy for all of his particular ailments. The person who attains friendliness with the universe will not have these pressures, but we can only be a friend when gradually we come to understand. Until then, the universe is a fearsome thing, frightening us. But as our own understanding broadens, its friendliness becomes apparent. We discover that we do not have to fight to live, that nothing that is done requires these mental and emotional pressures, and that the only effective way to do anything is in a relaxed and quiet manner. This gives us discretion, discrimination, and makes available to us the total resources of our own consciousness. Consequently, therapy is useless, essentially, unless the individual is really consecrated in his desire to get over his trouble and is willing to make major changes in his own perspectives in order to achieve security, peace of mind, and peace of heart. If he is willing to do these things, much can be done. Well, there's much more to say, but time is up, so we have to stop. I'd like to call attention to the fact that this afternoon at 2 o'clock, the PRS Center Study Group at our headquarters building on Griffith Park Boulevard in Los Feliz will meet to discuss the talk of the morning. Anyone who would like to participate in this discussion or come and watch others and listen to others discuss, gradually get themselves worked up until they forget themselves and discuss too, we hope that those of you who are interested will come. Next Sunday morning, we are taking as our subject astrology and epidemical disease. And we think this will be of interest to a good many persons. The peculiar development of epidemic. Have you ever realized that man, for the most part, does not stop epidemics? That they run courses and all of a sudden stop themselves? That they go through certain areas and do not touch others? The study of epidemical disease and its relationship to human life and human psychic entity is really well worth our thoughtfulness. In connection with the morning, we would like to suggest our book, Self-Unfoldment, for you, if you are interested in going further with this problem of gradual integration around a central core of consciousness. We think this will be of use. And the little lecture pamphlet, the Buddha's Sermon on the Mount, will also bring a number of very relevant ideas in this department to your attention. Also, may we call your attention that the new issue of our magazine, Horizon, is on the table and available this morning. Now, we thank you all very much and hope that you'll be with us next Sunday, and that by that time you will have made a marked attainment in this problem of self-adjustment.